Okay, this lecture is about justice as a characteristic, as a character trait. And the next lecture will be about politics because these are different in really, really important ways. So the previous lecture focused on personal virtues and vices, and then to some extent sociability, people you relate to as extended family and friends, perhaps. But this one is about how you habitually treat people you don't necessarily know personally, but they're fellow citizens with you living under a common body of laws. Another big theme in the Greek educational process and understanding of human nature is that there's no gap between personal, social, and political life. You have a whole life. Your life is a whole with parts. And you have to learn the virtues of, you learn justice as a virtue long before you start talking about making and breaking laws. So you teach your children to love justice as a characteristic. The other thing I wanted to start out then with, again, one of the personal virtues, courage, because it has so much connection to issues of justice. It's obvious that it does. And it does today in our society, American society. So let me just go over it again. It's the virtue in relationship to fear, situations involving fear, a sense of vulnerability. Um, so we're afraid of pain and physical pain, okay? Or pain from poverty. Poverty, sickness, death, or by accident, right? Just accidents. So this is where politically the politicians can really take advantage of our fears. And you can see how in America today the fear of death is leading to a huge economic way of making money, which again calls to mind what sort of laws we would need to regulate this money making. We're going into extreme debt in the government for all these reasons. So the fear of death affects our social life and our political life. Whether other Americans fear death affects me as a citizen because of the effect it has on the national deficit and things like that. So, so these things aren't simply personal; they also have a public side to them. We also fear having a bad reputation or being lonely or things like that, and that in general is a personal fear. Sometimes it has implications, but usually that is people have to deal with it on their own. Um, okay, the other one that's particularly public is the situation of security from violence, and particularly violence from foreigners. Um, so, fear, courage in relationship to war is something that the Greeks talked about a lot. Aristotle has a lot of distinctions, and I want to go through them because when I talk about the Iliad, or anybody listening to this who knows the Iliad or wants to read the Iliad, you definitely can have and should have, I think, this theoretical framework to discuss the characters. They just go hand in hand naturally. So, in cases involving war, you can overreact or underreact, and the characters in the Iliad do so. The other problem is, the main problem is who has the just cause. justice and injustice in establishing whether a war is just, and if so, why, and also, if so, making sure that people are being courageous. They're facing fear for the right reason in the right way. So, rational courage is to fear what you ought to fear for the right reason in the right way at the right time. So, the soldiers in the Iliad ought to be facing fearful situations for the right reason in the right way at the right time. And as I will point out, uh, both sides forgot the original cause. Nobody, there isn't one person in there who's actually fighting for the right reason in the right way. As far as I know, maybe Odysseus, but it's amazing how they totally lost track. So none of them really had rational courage. What they had instead was what Aristotle calls the second order types of courage. One example for the highest form of courage in war, besides rational courage, if you're a rational, if you exhibit rational courage in war, you know that you're fighting for a just cause, and you're fighting because there wasn't any alternative, and you're making sure not to engage in unnecessary killing. It's just war theory emerged from this tradition, and now we have many criteria for just war, and unfortunately, many of the characters violate all these criteria. It's just really pretty horrible. But the courage of a citizen soldier is not rational courage because they face fear, but for the wrong reason. And the reason might be because they are avoiding being reproached, being criticized by their family, their friends, their country, fellow citizens, and their commanding officer, or they want to avoid legal penalties. If you don't go fight, you're going to get arrested or end up in jail, things like that. Or you want to win honors. You want people to honor you. Now, that's a nice idea. It's just that it's the wrong reason, because that could drive people into war, into unjust wars, or it could drive them to fight unjustly, to make the wrong decision for the wrong reason in the wrong way because they've got the wrong goal, or because they're forced. Their superiors literally force them to fight, and that's not rational. Even if the superiors were correct and it was a just war, the citizen soldier who's forced to face the fear is not exercising virtue. Okay, another kind of courage is that of the seasoned professional soldier. And this is someone who assumes that they're superior, right? They have calculated what wars to fight or what battles to fight. They know they have the advantage, and they appear to be courageous and confident, but they're not really, because they already know they're going to win. And the way that you can tell is if someone has this kind of courage is sometimes they need to fight in a battle where they really know they aren't going to win, but they need to fight it anyway. And a professional soldier will run away because they don't really want to lose their skin. They were confident before because they knew they were going to succeed. One example was Iraq. When we went in there, I remember there were some seasoned professional soldiers who just put their arms down and gave up right away because they just didn't want to lose. They knew they didn't have a chance. So those And those were, that isn't authentic courage. They're in kind of a catch-22, whether it was right or wrong, but that's a good example. Um, Courage sometimes is emotion. People who beat their chest and are aggressive. This is the god Ares is like this, and Achilles was like this. They just want to show everybody how courageous they are, and Ares has a double-edged sword. He goes in and fights on both sides. He doesn't really care if his side is just. He just wants to prove himself and how brave he is. Um, he wants to show he can overcome pain. Sometimes a soldier fights in war because of wanting to take revenge, driven by the emotion of revenge. This is very irrational because it can just lead to massacre. It can be revenge for the wrong reason in the wrong way. It and it doesn't. You've totally lost track of what the original cause of the war was. Um, the rational. Oh, and sometimes people appear courageous because they're ignorant. They don't really know what's going on, and they think they're going to win, or they think it's a just cause, or whatever, and they're totally wrong. Again, with the Iraq War, I remember hearing about a soldier who was fighting with us, the good guy, except that he thought we together were fighting against, no, fighting with Saddam, because we actually used to be allies with Saddam. And so he thought we were still sort of in that mode. It's just kind of amazing how people lose track of what the heck's going on. Um, so, so that just shows you how the personal virtue of learning how to face fearful situations starts out. Children have to be taught not to be too phobic, but to be phobic enough, right? There's some things you have to be afraid of. Do not run out into the street. Um, and then they take that orientation with them into situations involving war. And then they also have to think about just and unjust causes, reasons for war. They have to think about just and unjust strategies. They also have to figure out to what extent do they have to obey their superior, even when they don't think it's a good decision, because wartime demands blind obedience to authority because it's such a critical and dangerous situation. So when I talk about the Iliad, I'll just try to make as many distinctions as um, there's time. I mean, you can just talk about it forever. You can write about it forever, and people have. I just want to give you the general idea that the Iliad is trying to educate people about war and about courage as a personal virtue in relationship to war, because it's a complicated issue. Okay, the other virtues particularly related to political life are the art of legislation. That's number one, knowing how to make good laws. That's what I mentioned at the beginning of the last um, lecture, was how do you make laws that promote human flourishing? And this is complicated. I'm going to give an example of something that seems obvious and yet is problematic. Many people want abortion to be illegal in our country because they think it's obvious that if legislation is trying to mold people to be virtuous, having abortion legal clearly undermines virtue. Um, I think that could be a strong argument, but let me take the other side. The other side will say, we talk about rights. Now I'm trying to deliberate in terms of Aristotle's categories, because we've totally given up on them, and they're still good categories to use. Okay, so let's take why abortion should be legal but rare and safe. Okay, the there's two political strategies. One is to make it illegal and let the chips fall where they will. The other one is to have it legal and then try to do what you can to prevent it. So, if you have policies that increase poverty, you're going to increase the number of abortions, whether it's legal or not. There actually were more abortions before it was made illegal, before it was made legal, when it was illegal than there are now. The number of abortions went up for 5 years after Roe versus Wade, I think, and after that it's been going down slowly ever since. So the actual number of abortions, plural, tends to go down when it's accompanied with programs to prevent poverty, because when people are poor, they get abortions. Programs to educate teenagers about honest sex education, and also to make birth control available to teenagers, because then they don't get pregnant, they don't panic, and they don't have abortions. So that's the idea, is you'd have this overall policy where you actually minimize the number of abortions, and people probably will be a little more moral. This is what happens in Britain, Europe. They have that kind of policy: education, birth control, and then abortion is a fallback. Nobody gets pregnant so they can get abortions. So you try to prevent the pregnancies. The other side can say, oh, well, I remember when abortion was illegal. And what happens is to undermine respect for laws. I don't think it makes people more virtuous. First of all, if you had any money and any support, your parents or friends or you could fly to Canada and get a safe abortion. It wasn't a problem, and everybody with any kind of resources and support did. I remember that. The people who were poor and teenagers who were desperate went underground, and there was a real dark, greed-driven, wicked network of underground abortions. And so people who were poor or desperate teenagers would get these really unsafe abortions, and oftentimes suffer some serious consequences. So what people learn is that when it's illegal, you learn how to disrespect the laws, because people get what they want. If they have the resources, they get it. If not, they don't. Then the punishment never fits the crime, not even close. Because if it's the killing of innocent life, many people who want it illegal want capital punishment. So I ask my students, you really want 2 million women a year to get the electric chair, to get capital punishment? And usually they say no. So what it is, the punishment is not at all proportionate to the crime, if that's what the crime is. And when it's illegal, that is what the crime is. So if you want to just have people in prison for life, you have 2 million more. And mostly if prison is about public safety, these 2 million women are not endangering the rest of the public. Then you have the problem with doctors who work in clinics where people are poor or teenagers, and they are the ones that have to tell this woman that she's pregnant, and they know she's going to panic. They know she's very likely to go underground and have an unsafe abortion. If a doctor like that gives her a phone number or a referral, the doctor loses their license to practice. Well, that seems uh, pretty dysfunctional to me, and I think when it was illegal, it created a lot of problems because it's not a good policy. So I think people who work on making abortion less common, people who work to, well, if you have halfway homes, if you have some kind of homes for unwed mothers or poor mothers, if you have some way that these women will not panic, some alternatives so that they don't panic and get abortions. That's much better, and I think it's better for the character of the citizens. I think there's a tendency to really idealize the effect of making abortion illegal on people's character, especially if it's been legal for a number of decades and people have forgotten what it was actually like. So that's just one example of how, when Aristotle says legislators make laws to make people good, mold people to be virtuous, it doesn't necessarily mean all the politicians who talk about character and talk about virtue and claim that a certain law will make people virtuous. That's controversial. It's a matter of debate. Um, okay, so the art of legislation is very important, and it's ambiguous. It's difficult. Um, and I think overall, the goal of nurturing a middle class society and nurturing the virtues of generosity and self control is what Aristotle recommends as developing a citizen body of people who actually care about each other. They have goodwill toward each other. They want each other to be successful. They have friendship. They agree with each other on public policy and public issues. And of course, when you have a polarized citizenry, it's really, really difficult. When people don't trust each other's judgment, when they don't trust each other's character. And so when politicians play on the differences between their positions and they polarize people and they demonize one political recipe or party or set of policies as more wicked than they actually are, it undermines the whole society. Everybody suffers. So I think it's important that we deliberate about the art of legislation, what kind of laws promote well-being. The next one is pleasure from gain, the business sector. Laws have to be made about how to make money. You have to regulate the economic sector of society. How you do so? Aristotle would say you need to do it in a way that nurtures a large middle class, and it's not intuitively obvious that that means the government should intervene. It doesn't mean what kind of interventions. Do you regulate up front? Like what level of fossil fuel pollution a company is allowed to create? Then companies will develop differently. On the other hand, the other way is to tax profits and redistribute wealth. So just the main thing is that there have to be some kind of regulations. But he does not accept a government-controlled economy, and he argues against communism, uh, and gives good arguments. People won't be motivated, that kind of thing. So I would categorize him at this point in history as between. He would be for some kind of mix and different kinds of ways of regulating the economic sector. The next thing is distribution of wealth, and this obviously is tied to the economic sector, but how salaries should be distributed, and people disagree on this. In distribution of wealth, people need unequal. You have to start out with the principle of inequality, which of course throws um, people today totally off. But, for example, I don't need the opportunity to get a PhD in math because, I would flunk. Um, People are unequal in the kinds of education that would best develop their capabilities. They are unequal. Their needs are different. Children need different things than adults. Children need to be protected from abuse more than adults. Um, it's really common sense. And then you just realize that a lot of the judgments we make presuppose inequality, even though we deny it. So, Aristotle emphasizes inequality in human relationships, the parent child relationship, the employer employee relationship, the ruler ruled relationship, the leader subject relationship. So, he emphasizes what is the responsibility of the leaders. What sort of laws or rules do they make when they're running an organization? How do they rule for the well-being of the ruled? So his view isn't to try to minimize the existence of authority. His view is to educate people so they exercise authority well. And then in a really healthy society, citizens, bound together under a rule of law, will take turns ruling and being ruled, and so that everyone gets a chance to rule, and so that they can actually exercise those capacities, the capacity to engage in making laws. So it's not anti-democratic, and it's just acknowledges that there's a dynamic. People have relationships based on inequality and equality. Um, Within a company, you have your co-workers, and then you have all sorts of hierarchies. And so the key is making sure that everyone exercises the expertise they have for the well-being of everyone else. I think especially in this high-tech era, when at work people really do specialize a lot, they have to trust each other that they're doing their job well because they don't know the nature of the job. So that's, you have to emphasize being trustworthy and honest, having goodwill for other people, being in concord, being in agreement about what the common good is. So I think it's better to mix it. Some relationships are equal, some unequal, and the fact that we have to deal with power and authority issues and just do it well. The other one is the rectification of laws, and this is the criminal sector, criminal law. In that case, everyone ought to be equal. If somebody gets killed, they should get the same, their relatives should get the same recourse to justice if they're rich or poor, black or white. And this is funny because, of course, we call our system based on freedom and equality, and yet we know that if you have more money, you can get a better lawyer, and justice is not served. If you're poor, you're less likely to get the same level of punishment for someone who murdered your relative or whatever it is. But in theory, it should be equal. There's two kinds of rectification. There's criminal law, violence, and then there's civil law, where people violate some other rule. Okay, so, and then the last virtue, so, is equity, and this is the virtue that a judge is paid to exercise day in and day out. So the laws are inherently universal, whereas particular cases are particular. And so there's a virtue of being able to apply a general law to a particular case and to do it well. And the Supreme Court justices, some of them get reputations for being better or worse at applying our laws and deciding what's constitutional and what's not. And but it's important for us to deliberate about that and talk about it and talk about, well, if we think there's a problem, is the problem in our Constitution? Or is the problem in the judges because they're not exercising equity? Why is it that what's decided changes so much? It shouldn't. What happened in Citizens United that hadn't been there before? And how did that, supposedly, we should have a much more consistent system. So there's problems there. And even if citizens don't exercise power, the activity of discussing other people's decisions is an important part of educating yourself, educating your mind, educating yourself for practical wisdom, because you need to have all that information, all those opinions and judgments and reflections, so that when, as a matter of fact, you have to make a decision in a particular case, or you have to, in a critical moment, that your choice will be based on years and hours of reflection and thought about this. So the five main virtues in relationship to citizenship are the art of legislation, distribution of wealth, rectification of wrongs, equity, and the pleasure from gain. And this is how we cultivate our relationships to each other. Okay, the next thing Aristotle talks about, which is also really important, is the discussion of decision making. And this is important because he says the study of decisions is more important than the study of actions, because decisions, not actions, determine character. This is so important because we tend to focus on the action, what happened, something observable, but we don't know why. And we don't know why in the sense of what's the character of the person who did it. I mean, things blow up in places like Ferguson, Missouri. Well, was the police officer, was this totally by chance, an accident? What were the circumstances? And then the next thing is there some habitual way? Did the particular people involved habitually behave this way and that, and so it finally came to a head? Or how is it that the town as a whole has been organized so that there is all this animosity, and this is just one tiny little piece? And then what laws could be changed? Or what about distribution of wealth? What about a history of the legal system? What about the business sector? Is there a depression going on? I mean, these are common questions. It's just that Aristotle's view is, yes, you have to look at the big picture, and you have to look at the character of the people. You have to look at whether parents are nurturing their children to exercise the virtues. You have to look at whether the parents have the resources, economic resources, educational resources, so that their children actually can develop those virtues. And this is what actually happens. So even though we use this abstract language of rights, what we actually do is a lot more like what Aristotle talks about. And all he's doing is telling us we ought to talk about this. This is what really matters. remember, an action is not just unless it's done for its own sake, by someone, uh, for the right reason in the right way, because it's the just thing to do, and by a person who habitually does just things. And so we have to look at how are we creating communities where there's a habitual cultivation of the vices, injustice, just the way the system works, the way the community works. So this links Aristotle back to Laszlo and systems thinking. They're very much attuned to the overall context and system, even though they're not relativists. So uh, there are certain thinkers that will emphasize context, but somehow that leads to relativism, and that's not true. That's a false dichotomy. You can focus on context and continually deliberate in a way that could also be true of Cortez and the Mayans or any society. These are categories that go back to the human condition constantly, and that's how you should see them. Because we are social and political creatures, because we're vulnerable, because we are driven by pleasure, pain, and fear, these things will come up. They naturally emerge as a product. They naturally emerge as we try to simply develop our souls as the creature with reflective self-conscious awareness, with the capacity to understand. And so that's why the whole context for something like Ferguson is important, because people have memories and people have interpreted the situation in the past. People have opinions based on long-term experience. And this is what's really going on, and figuring out how to make the overall system more just is the real question and what's really important. And everybody knows that as common sense, but it's not the way we tend to react. It's not public discourse, maybe private discourse, but not public discourse, and that's what we really have to work on. Okay, so in the question of decisions, we have voluntary actions, and this is another thing that's very important. He says voluntary actions always involve beliefs. All right, so what this means is we are driven by our thoughts. When people say people are driven by pleasure or fear, that's just not true. The pleasure and fear gets attached to a long-term habit and a thought. Even in the critical moment, people will think. Or if honestly it was a completely impulsive reaction, like a reflex reaction, people reflect on it and develop a whole set of beliefs and habits, and that controls their character, and that controls how likely just or unjust actions are going to happen in the future. So these are the things that really matter. Um, okay, there are things not under human control. So sometimes communities fall apart because of tsunami. There was a community in Santorini called Akrikori, which was a very just community, I think, very well functioning, and it died because of tsunami, not because it was unjust or self-destructive. So there's certain things, certain failure to flourish, that just is a matter of accident. Um, Other things are a certain community can exist in a place where the natural surroundings are very difficult to survive in, and the difficulty just ended up finally becoming impossible. So there's things like that because we do depend. Culture depends on nature. So sometimes nature just, there's a drought, for example, that's not a question of choice or character. Um, okay, but then there are the things that are under human control. And there's two kinds. There's the ones that are aimed at production, where the ultimate goal is in the product that you make. This is like if you wanted to make a good table, you could be a bad person and make good tables, furniture, or clothing, or whatever. Um, then there is, when it comes to things like that, okay, so his examples are the crafts, like a table, the arts, and the example I'm going to use there is rap music. In the business sector, just I'm going to use the corporations, just corporate life right now in the USA, and medicine. So in the crafts, you could, um, well, let's take a shoemaker because Socrates used to use the shoemaker analysis. Um, all right, in each case, you have certain beliefs about what your goal is. Your object of wish is your your idea about the good life. Your object of decision is what you think the options are for you, and then your object of choice is which option you take, and then you actually take it. So, all right, with the shoemaker, what is the shoemaker's goal? Is it just to make as much money as possible? Is it to develop a reputation in her profession? Or is it to promote human flourishing? All right. So if the goal is just to make money, let's just take an example. Let's just hypothesize that this would be true. That somebody decides the best way to make money is to um, have, obviously, go abroad, pay people very little money, make a whole bunch of shoes, and sell them at a profit. And that's how to maximize your profits, is pay people as little as possible and crank out as much as possible. Economy of scale. Your object of wish is simply the good life is to make money and everybody gets a chance, so go ahead. The options are whether to hire people here or abroad, um, and you decide to hire abroad, and then you do it. And you have an idea of the good. That's the main thing. You have an idea of the good. It's a free market. This is the way the free market works. We hire, look at all the people we're giving jobs to. There's lots of arguments. And my main point here is that you have an object of wish, your idea of the human good. You have options, and you choose from among those options, and then you act on it. So you can decide to make a lot of money and hire offshore. Now, you could decide as a shoemaker you wanted a great reputation, and so you would just make, let's just say, very exclusive shoes, high quality. Only the richest can buy them. But it gives you status, right? Because you're a great designer. But the shoes themselves ruin women's feet, which a lot of shoes do. I can't believe young women who wear these high-heeled shoes with the pointed toes. My mother and mother-in-law both had foot surgery, and they didn't wear shoes nearly that high-heeled or pointed-toed. And it's just really not good for you. It's not good for your body when you're walking in them. It's not good for what's going to happen to your feet, but you're going to get a reputation. You're going to get status. So your object of wish is status. Your options are, well, who do I design for? Whatever. You choose the one that has the most status and you go for it. Then there's the shoemaker who actually wants to make a shoe that is good for people. It serves its function well. And that shoemaker wants every person with every kind of expertise to always exercise it for the well-being of the people over who use their products, because then you would have an overall flourishing society. So that would be their object of wish or their philosophy. Of course, that's what Aristotle would say is the rational person. They're making money for the right reason in the right way, and everyone who's rational would have the same goal. Whether you're making shoes or tables or whatever, it's always to perform its function well and to be high quality, to have some sense of style without being ostentatious or without adding a lot to the price. And then you would have all these options. Yeah, what should the style be? How high quality? How can you have a high quality shoe without it becoming too expensive? And then you'd have all these options, and then always with an idea to human flourishing. You'd make your decision and then you'd act on it. Okay, so that's with shoemaking, the different options: making money, status, or human flourishing. Okay, what about the arts? Rap music. I have a student who's doing a report on this. So he says hip-hop started out as a way for people who've been marginalized from the society to communicate, to express themselves, and it performed an important social function because it alerted the rest of us to the kinds of toxic environments that we're allowing to exist. At least wake us up, at least make us aware. We can start finger pointing or whatever we want to do, but if we don't even know what's going on, we're going to be ignorant. So the original motive was one that was socially beneficial, it was educational, it was giving people without a voice in the society, which is good. It's educating other people about what's going on. It's creating community of people who want to fix a problem or basically encourage human flourishing. So it was originally organized in a way that would trigger the desire to understand and trigger better laws or better attitudes or whatever, something good, something that would promote flourishing. Now, what happened, he says, is that people get corrupted by greed, or they get corrupted by status. So maybe they'll get more status if they create all this incredibly highly sexed images or excess anger. They might make more money at it, and then they get corrupted by greed. They might do things that are adversarial or toxic because they get status for it, like something super outrageous just to show people that, hey, I can do that, and they would get honored for that. Just like Aries going in there and fighting on both sides, just taking this huge risk, creating all this animosity, but getting honored for it. So that's the same thing. The object of wish originally was the desire to promote flourishing by exposing problems, which is what tragedy and all these other documents do, or forms of art forms do, and then deliberate about exactly how to do the rap that would promote flourishing through expressing the dark side, through wanting to communicate and wanting to use that as a tool to build a bridge of communication, and then just you're constantly deciding, what are my options, what sort of song, what sort of tune, what sort of words, and then doing it. But if that's your goal, definitely you're going to come out with a very different product than rap that's designed to make money or designed to get a reaction, be honored by some group for the wrong reasons. So that's another example. The business sector in the United States right now, I think I'm completely in favor of a private economy as opposed to a public, government-controlled economy. But there's the system can become out of balance, which obviously Aristotle would say that. He would agree with that. And he would say that the two main power points in any society are the economic sector. Well, three. The economic sector is a place where power can get centralized in the oligarchy. The military sector can get focused on empire building, just building a political military empire, or the government can, political rulers can just want their own aristocracy. For example, they want a dynasty. They just want to keep their family and friends inheriting political power. Okay, so these are all touch points, danger points for a society losing any kind of community sense. In every case, the uneducated, the masses, in the case of the rich, the rule of the rich, they're exploited and underpaid, overworked, no safety, no education, obviously no health care. Plus, they can get sent to war for the sake of wealth if the oligarchs take over. If the military takes over, the masses are again abused, sent off to war for the benefit of the few who are obsessed with a military empire building. And they just use fear. They say, oh, we have to go after these people or they'll go after us. And the uneducated, undereducated can just get used. The aristocratic class can say, well, we're practically wise. We know because we've passed on power from generation to generation, and we have all these wonderful debates among ourselves, and we have experience. Our family has long-standing experience, so you should just allow us to maintain power and privilege. None of those are functional, because the best society is one where people take turns ruling and being ruled in turn. Now, I'm going to cut this one short and move into the next video, and it will continue on the question of politics. It'll be politics part 2.